Hello, Avila Advantage students. We're now in week 2, so good job with the forum discussion last week. We're going to have another forum discussion that's going to be about a brief video from our former Federal Reserve Chairman, Alan Greenspan. He's kind of two back. Currently, we have Janet Yellen, and before that was Ben Bernanke, but he talks a little bit about his upbringing in New York and the American dream. So follow the directions in the forum discussion and make sure you get your post in early by Wednesday at the latest, and the follow-up post to appear by Friday, and then finally making one more post to appear by Sunday at least. So you can still get those posts done earlier in the week. It's just you have to have them by those deadlines. This week we're going to look at Chapter 3. If you've had micro, this should be a little bit of review for you, but it's the meat and potatoes of economics, supply and demand from a market perspective. And this is more looking at summation of individual demand curves or individual supply curves to make up a market demand curve or a market supply curve. And in your text, it distinguishes between what we call a change in quantity demanded and a change in demand. So I want you to think of a change in quantity demand as just simply movement along the demand curve. If the price goes up, you're going to move up that demand curve. If the price goes down, you're going to move along the demand curve. And it's factors other than price that are going to impact shifts or what we call changes in demand. So if Oprah says you need to read this book now, it would shift the demand curve out for that book. Or if somebody puts a tax on a particular product on the consumer, it would likely shift that demand curve in. So you're going to go review some of those things. But typically we think of demand curve shifts, we think of due to it through taxes, subsidies, expectations, income. All these could shift the demand curve in a market. Just like last week we talked about avocados, that if all of a sudden the supply is no longer there, then that's going to shift the supply curve in, and we would have less avocados and they'd be more expensive. So with that, with the supply side, it's the same thing. With a change in quantity supplied, it's a movement along the supply curve, dealing specifically with price, but I want you to think if it's a factor other than price, it's a shift or change in that supply curve. And typical changes can be tied to expectations, taxes, subsidies, production, and technology. So any one of those things. And really what you do in this chapter is also you look at points of what we call like equilibrium, where they cross up and you find an equilibrium price and quantity in a market. And if it is not an equilibrium, say there's a shift in one of the curves, there's either going to be a surplus or a shortage in the market, that old price. And it's going to work to get back to a new existing price and eventually get to it where it's an equilibrium in the market. And you also discuss things such as, particularly tied to the demand side, about it, normal goods and inferior goods. If your income goes up, you'd buy more of a normal good. If your income goes up, you'd probably buy less of an inferior good, say like ramen noodles. I know that was popular in college, but you didn't have a lot of income, so you had to buy like cheap, not very good quality food. And then complement and substitute. What you think of a substitute is that one you consider similar in nature. If you're indifferent between a generic detergent and Tide, you would go with the cheaper one. But that's a lot of what the marketing job is, to try to convince you that there are differences between the two. And there are differences in certain products, but a lot of times in grocery stores, it's manufactured by the same company. You just don't know it. So trying to distinguish which one is the real one is a hard thing to do sometimes. And then complementary, good example would be gasoline. I've seen this week that OPEC got together and they actually cut production. So if gas prices do start to rise back up this summer to say $3, $4, probably the demand for trucks and SUVs are going to decline. So that's a good example of complement. If you want to have your truck run, you got to have gasoline. All right. Chapter 19, if we look at that chapter, it talked about the goals. This is GDP, inflation, unemployment are like the big three. We want to keep the economy growing. We want to keep unemployment low. And we want to keep inflation stable, because if you have a lot of inflation, that has wealth effects. And they talked about some of the frameworks we'll start to examine in these coming chapters. You know, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis, the Keynesian, the neoclassical, and they talked about the policy tools. So you're going to look at from the fiscal side in this course, taxation, spending, and you're also going to look at the monetary side from the Federal Reserve, controlling the money supply. So a lot of this chapter 2 deals with some of the basic measurements, especially with GDP. It looks at an aggregate expenditures approach, where we kind of measure it in terms of C plus I plus G plus net exports, and you'll read more about that in your book. Most of it is driven by consumption. That's the C component. That represents about 2/3 of our economy. And they give other examples like net national product or national income, different approaches to how we can measure the economy. So, but the main thing about gross domestic product, I want you to think of it this way. It's the amount of final goods and services produced within the United States borders, regardless of who owns those. And whether it's a Toyota plant in Kentucky, since it's still produced in Kentucky, we consider that part of GDP, and it's all final goods. So it's kind of like what you think about taking the value of all those final goods and services produced in a given year, and that's how we measure nominal GDP. Now, the textbook talks about real GDP. Real GDP nets out things attributed to just simply inflation or price increases. So I'll give you a real simple example. Let's say we have a survivor island economy, and all we do is produce coconuts, and the price of a coconut is $1 in 2016. And we picked 100 coconuts, so nominal GDP would be $100. In year 2, if the price of coconuts goes to $2 and we still pick 100 coconuts, the nominal GDP is $200. So it appears that GDP has doubled in value. But the reality is, if you net out the factor that it was all due to a price increase from going from $1 to $2, really GDP had stayed flat and not changed at all. So what real GDP does is it uses a price deflator to put it in what we call real terms, to give us a true measurement of the actual physical goods and services produced in a given time period. Okay, and this chapter also talks a little bit about the business cycle. It's something that we observe over periods of times. You know, we have maybe peaks, we have troughs. After 2008, we had a big downturn, and we've kind of been working our way back till we have, lower unemployment. We're on the path for good GDP growth, and inflation stayed relatively stable. So hopefully that is going to be the point for the future, and the markets at least appear happy right now that that is going to be some of the future. So, but still a lot of variables, still a lot of unknowns. So we'll see what happens. But anyway, I will talk to you online this week. Have a great week, and we'll see you later. Take care.